Have you ever watched a family fall apart because of one final message from someone they thought they understood? Stay with me because this story begins at my father's funeral and ends with a last wish that changed every life in that room forever. The last time I saw my father alive, he couldn't even speak. He simply reached for my hand, squeezed it once, and looked at me as if he wanted to say something he had been holding back for years. 2 days later, he was gone. My name is Leanda Masiko. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a civil engineer in Pretoria, South Africa. I wasn't the successful child in my family's eyes. My older brother always received the praise, while I was the quiet son who stayed away from arguments. When my father, Bakizwe Masiko, passed away, everyone expected a simple reading of his will. Instead, his attorney unfolded a handwritten letter titled, "My Final Wish." Within minutes, accusations filled the room, old secrets resurfaced, and the family I thought I knew began falling apart before my eyes. I stood quietly beside my father's coffin as relatives filled the funeral hall one by one. The room was heavy with sadness, but beneath the tears, something else was growing. People hugged each other, offered polite condolences, then slowly gathered into small groups, whispering about what would happen after the funeral. My mother, Namand Masiko, sat silently in the front row, staring at the flowers without saying a word. My older brother, Mandla Masiko, moved confidently through the crowd, thanking guests while several relatives quietly reminded him that he would probably become the head of the family now. Listening to them made me uncomfortable because it seemed like some people had already stopped mourning my father and had started thinking about his money instead. After the burial, our family followed the attorney to my father's office, where everyone believed the will would be read quickly before we all went home. The atmosphere felt tense but predictable. Some relatives were already discussing who might receive the house, the business, and the family land. A few even smiled as if they already knew their share. I stayed silent, remembering the last time I had held my father's hand in the hospital. He had looked into my eyes as though he wanted to tell me something important, but the words never came. The attorney placed a thick envelope on the table and waited until every chair was filled. He looked around the room carefully before clearing his throat. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "Mr. Bakizwe Masiko left very clear instructions. No one is allowed to leave this room until his final written request has been read completely." The room instantly became silent. Confused faces turned toward one another as whispers spread across the table. No one had expected anything like this. One uncle laughed nervously, thinking it was only a legal formality, but the attorney shook his head. His expression remained serious as he explained that my father had personally insisted this rule be followed without exception. Anyone who ignored his instructions would lose every right to their inheritance. The quiet room suddenly filled with nervous tension. The grief we had carried into the funeral was slowly being replaced by fear, curiosity, and questions no one could answer. At that moment, I realized my father's final goodbye was only just beginning. The attorney slowly broke the seal on the thick envelope and carefully unfolded several handwritten pages. Everyone leaned forward, expecting to hear the usual legal words about houses, bank accounts, and property. Instead, the attorney looked up and quietly said, "These are Mr. Bakizwe Masiko's own words." The room became completely silent. Even the sound of people breathing seemed loud. I could feel my heart beating faster as the first line was read aloud. "My beloved family, if you are listening to this letter, then my time has come. Before anyone thinks about money, I need you to hear the truth that I was too afraid to say while I was alive." The words hit every person in the room. No one expected my father to begin his final message this way. The attorney continued reading without stopping. My father admitted that for many years he had watched our family slowly change. Love had been replaced by jealousy. Honest conversations had been replaced by lies. Favoritism had quietly divided us until some people felt important while others felt invisible. He confessed that every family gathering brought him more pain because he saw people pretending to care while secretly competing with each other. As those words echoed through the room, no one dared to interrupt. Some relatives lowered their heads. Others avoided making eye contact. My brother Mandla crossed his arms and stared at the table, while my mother wiped fresh tears from her face. It felt as though my father was standing among us, exposing truths that everyone had tried to ignore for years. Then the attorney reached the next page and paused before reading the sentence that changed everything. None of you will receive a single part of my estate until you complete one final request exactly as I have written it. There will be no exceptions, no negotiations, and no shortcuts." A wave of shocked whispers spread across the room. Several relatives looked at each other in complete disbelief. One cousin immediately asked what the request was, while another complained that this was unfair. Before anyone could argue further, the attorney raised his hand and continued, "My final wish must be completed by every beneficiary. Anyone who refuses, argues against it, or walks away will immediately lose every right to my inheritance." The room fell into complete silence once again. The confidence people had shown only minutes earlier completely disappeared. The excitement about money had turned into fear and uncertainty. For the first time that day, everyone realized my father's greatest gift was not going to be his wealth. It was going to be the truth, and none of us were prepared for what was coming next. After the attorney finished reading that shocking part of my father's letter, he walked to a large table standing against the wall. Covering it was a white cloth. Without saying a word, he slowly pulled the cloth away. Underneath were several small wooden boxes, each carefully sealed with dark red wax. Every box had only one name written on it. No explanations. No labels. Just the name of the person who was supposed to receive it. The room became completely silent. Nobody understood what these boxes contained or why my father had prepared them. One by one, the attorney handed each person their own box. My hands felt strangely heavy as I accepted mine. I looked around and saw the same confusion on every face. Even Mandla, who always acted confident, looked nervous as he turned his box over in his hands. The attorney quietly said, "Mr. Bakis, we instructed that every person must open only their own box. Everything inside has been collected by him over many years. Read every page before saying a single word." I carefully broke the seal. Inside were old family photographs, folded letters, handwritten notes, receipts, and small envelopes with dates written on them. At first, I couldn't understand why my father had kept such ordinary things. Then I opened the first letter. It described a family dinner that had taken place nearly 15 years earlier. I remembered that evening clearly, but my father had written down details that no one else had noticed. He wrote about who spoke kindly, who stayed silent, and who secretly insulted another family member after everyone else had left. My father had quietly watched everything. As I continued reading, I realized he had done this for years. Nearly every important family argument, celebration, and painful moment had been carefully documented in his own handwriting. He had never told any of us. He had simply observed, remembered, and written everything down. Around the room, people reacted very differently. One aunt suddenly covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes after reading about an act of kindness she had completely forgotten. Across the table, one of my cousins quickly closed his box, his face turning pale after discovering a letter that exposed a lie he had hidden for years. Another relative stared at an old receipt that proved someone else had secretly paid a debt he had always claimed to settle himself. The room grew heavier with every passing minute. Nobody was talking anymore. The sound of pages turning had replaced every conversation. The deeper we read, the more uncomfortable we became. These were not ordinary memories. They were pieces of truth buried for decades, and my father had preserved every one of them. We had all come expecting an inheritance, but instead we were being forced to face the family we had truly become. As I continued reading through the papers inside my box, I found another envelope with the words, "Things I never wanted credit for." My hands trembled as I slowly opened it. Inside were copies of bank transfers, tuition payment receipts, hospital invoices, and handwritten notes from my father explaining why he had chosen to help people without ever telling anyone. I stared at the documents in disbelief. My father had quietly carried the weight of this family for years while allowing everyone else to believe they had succeeded on their own. The first receipt showed that my father had secretly paid my cousin's entire university tuition after his parents could no longer afford it. Yet for years my cousin proudly told everyone that he had built his future through hard work alone. The next document revealed that one of my uncles had nearly lost his home because of unpaid debts. Before the bank could take the property, my father quietly settled the amount without asking for thanks or recognition. My uncle never mentioned it because he never knew who had rescued him. Then I found hospital bills with my mother's handwriting on the envelopes. My father had paid for expensive medical treatments for two relatives who later acted as though he had never supported them. Reading those papers made my chest feel heavy. The man many people called strict had actually spent years protecting the same family that often criticized him behind his back. Around the room, similar discoveries were changing every face. The confidence people had carried into the meeting was slowly disappearing. Some relatives wiped tears from their eyes as they realized how much they truly owed my father. Others sat frozen, unable to speak after learning that the success they proudly celebrated had been quietly built on his sacrifices. Then I noticed my brother Mandla stop reading. His face lost all color. He slowly reached for another letter, then another, as if hoping they would say something different. Finally, he lowered his head into his hands. My father had written that Mandla's first promotion at work had only happened because he personally asked an old business friend to give his son a chance after Mandla had failed an important interview. Later letters showed that several other opportunities had also come through quiet recommendations my father never revealed. For years, Mandla believed every achievement belonged only to him. He often reminded everyone that he had reached success without anyone's help. Now the truth sat in front of him in black ink. Every page slowly broke apart the pride he had carried for years. No one argued anymore. No one defended themselves. The room was filled with silence, regret, and tears. My father's greatest sacrifice had never been his money. It had been choosing to help the people he loved while asking for absolutely nothing in return. Just when I thought my father's documents could no longer surprise me, I noticed something strange. A single name kept appearing again and again in different letters, receipts, and handwritten notes. The name was always written carefully, almost as if it meant more than anything else. Amara Ndlovu. I frowned as I whispered the name to myself. I had never heard it before. I looked across the room, expecting someone else to recognize it, but every face showed the same confusion. My mother looked puzzled. My brother slowly searched through his own papers, and within seconds, he also found the same name written on several pages. Soon the silence was broken. "Who is Amara Ndlovu?" one of my cousins asked loudly. Another relative quickly added, "I've never heard that name in this family." Within moments, everyone began talking at once. Some believed she must have been an old business partner. Others wondered if she was a distant relative nobody knew about. One uncle even suggested she might have been someone trying to take part of the inheritance. The room quickly filled with nervous questions and suspicious whispers. The attorney remained calm. He listened patiently until everyone became quiet again. Then he folded his hands and said, "Mr. Bakizwe gave me very clear instructions. I am not allowed to explain who Amara Ndlovu is yet. He wanted every piece of the truth to be discovered one step at a time." His answer only made everyone more anxious. I returned to my papers and found another letter mentioning Amara. This time my father had written, "Never forget the person who carried your future when nobody else could." My heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Who was this woman? And why had my father written about her with so much respect? The more documents we opened, the more often her name appeared. There were old receipts connected to her, handwritten thank you notes that were never sent, and even faded photographs where one person's face had been carefully folded out of view. It was obvious my father had gone to great lengths to protect her identity for many years. Slowly, everyone in the room realized this was not just another forgotten name. Amara Ndlovu had somehow been connected to the biggest moments in our family's history. Yet none of us had ever been told she existed. The atmosphere changed once again. People stopped talking about money altogether. Now every conversation focused on one question. Who was Amara Ndlovu? As I looked down at another sealed envelope with her name written across the front, I realized my father's greatest secret had not been revealed yet. In fact, it felt like the real story was only beginning, and whatever truth waited inside that final envelope was powerful enough to change everything we believed about our family forever. The room remained silent as every eye turned toward the attorney. After allowing a few moments to pass, he slowly reached for one final envelope that had been kept separate from all the others. He looked around the table before speaking in a calm voice. "Mr. Bakizwe instructed me that this part of his letter should only be read after every family member had discovered the name Amara Ndlovu for themselves." My heart began to race. At last, we were about to learn the truth. The attorney carefully unfolded the pages and began reading my father's words. "If my family has reached this point, then it is finally time for you to know the name of the person who made everything you own possible." Everyone leaned forward. Many years ago, when my business was only weeks away from collapsing, I had nothing left. The bank was preparing to seize everything. Friends disappeared. Business partners abandoned me. Even people I trusted believed I would fail. I was completely alone. The room was so quiet that nobody even moved. Then one person stepped forward. Her name was Amara Ndlovu. The attorney continued reading. My father explained that Amara had believed in him when no one else did. She had trusted him enough to lend him her life savings without asking for a contract, interest, or ownership of the business. She simply believed he deserved one more chance. That money allowed him to keep the company alive long enough to rebuild it. Without her kindness, the business would have closed forever, and everything our family owned today would never have existed. A wave of disbelief spread across the room. My brother slowly shook his head. My mother covered her mouth with trembling hands. Several relatives looked at each other in complete shock. None of us had ever heard this story before. The attorney continued reading. Amara asked for only one thing in return. She told me that if I ever became successful, I should never forget those who help others without expecting anything back. I made her a promise that one day I would repay her kindness. My father's words became even more emotional. Life separated us before I could keep that promise. I searched for her for many years but never found her. That promise has remained unfinished in my heart. Then came the final instruction. My last wish is that part of my estate be used to honor the promise I made to Amara Ndlovu. Find her, or if she is no longer alive, help the people she loved. Only then will my soul rest in peace. Before the attorney could finish, angry voices filled the room. One uncle stood up immediately. Why should our family's inheritance go to someone who isn't even related to us? Another cousin nodded in agreement. Our father worked for this money. It belongs to his family. But others disagreed. My mother quietly wiped away her tears and whispered, "Without Amara, none of this would exist. She deserves to be remembered." I remained silent, staring at my father's letter. For the first time, I understood that this inheritance had never been about wealth. It was about keeping a promise made by an honest man who refused to forget the person who had saved his future. The family was now divided, and I knew the hardest part of my father's final wish had only just begun. The moment the attorney finished reading my father's final request about Amara Ndlovu, the room exploded with arguments. The silence that had filled the house only seconds earlier disappeared completely. Everyone began talking at once. Some people stood up from their chairs, while others pointed fingers across the table. It no longer felt like a family gathering. It felt like strangers fighting over something they believed belonged only to them. My brother Manla was the first to speak loudly. He slammed his hand on the table and shook his head in frustration. "This isn't right," he said. "Father cannot expect us to give away part of our inheritance to someone we don't even know. There has to be another way." Several relatives immediately agreed with him. One uncle insisted that the will should be challenged in court. A cousin claimed my father must have been emotional when he wrote the letter, and that no judge would allow such a condition to stand. Others quietly nodded, hoping someone would find a way to protect their share of the estate. My mother, Namand, remained seated. Although tears still filled her eyes, she spoke softly but firmly. "Please stop arguing," she said. "Your father thought about this for many years. If this was his last wish, we should at least respect it before judging it." Her words brought only a few seconds of silence before the arguments started again. Some relatives even moved into the corners of the room, whispering among themselves. I noticed two cousins searching online for inheritance laws on their phones. Another relative quietly asked the attorney whether there were any legal loopholes that could cancel my father's condition. The attorney simply shook his head. "Mr. Bakizwe expected these reactions," he replied calmly. "Everything you are saying has already been addressed." Those words caught my attention. I looked back inside my box and noticed another small envelope I had not opened before. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, were the words, "For Luyanda, when the arguments begin." My heart skipped a beat. I carefully opened the envelope while everyone else continued arguing. Inside was another handwritten letter. "If you are reading this," my father wrote, "then everything has happened exactly as I expected. Some will choose gratitude. Others will choose greed. Do not allow their anger to distract you from what is right." I continued reading. "They will question my decisions. They will search for legal excuses. They will say Amara deserves nothing because she shares no blood with us. But remember this, my son. Character is revealed when money is involved. Every sentence felt as though my father were sitting beside me. He had predicted every objection before anyone even spoke it aloud. He knew exactly how our family would react. As I folded the letter, I made a quiet decision. I would follow every instruction my father had left behind, no matter how difficult it became. Around me the arguments grew louder, but inside my heart everything had become clear. This journey was no longer about inheritance. It was about honoring the final promise of the man who had spent his entire life putting others before himself. The morning after the meeting, I packed a small bag and gathered every letter, photograph, and note my father had left behind. Hidden inside the final envelope was a hand-drawn map with the name of a small rural community. On the back, my father had written only one sentence. If you truly want to understand me, this is where your journey begins. Without telling anyone except my mother, I got into my car and followed the directions. The drive took several hours. As the busy city disappeared behind me, the roads became quieter, surrounded by open fields and small villages. I kept wondering who Amara Ndlovu really was, and why my father had protected her story for so many years. When I finally arrived, the community looked peaceful and simple. Small homes stood close together, and everyone seemed to know each other. I showed one elderly man the faded photograph my father had left. The moment he saw it, his eyes widened. "You've come looking for Amara," he said softly. My heart skipped a beat. He smiled gently and asked me to follow him. Soon we arrived at a modest house surrounded by flowers. Sitting on the front porch was an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair. She looked at the photograph in my hands, then quietly whispered my father's name. Bakizwe. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Before I could even introduce myself, she smiled through those tears and said, "You must be Luyanda. You look just like your father." I stood frozen. She had recognized me without ever meeting me before. As we sat together, Amara slowly shared a story that changed everything I believed about my family's past. More than 30 years earlier, my father's business had completely fallen apart. Banks refused to help him. Friends turned away. He was days from losing everything he had worked for. Amara had been saving money for her own dream of opening a small shop. Instead of using those savings for herself, she handed every cent to my father because she believed he was an honest man who deserved one final chance. She never asked for ownership. She never demanded repayment. She simply trusted his word. "I didn't save him because I expected anything," she said quietly. "I helped because someone once helped me when I had nothing." As news spread that I had arrived, several older community members gathered outside. One by one, they confirmed every part of her story. Some remembered watching Amara sell her jewelry to raise more money. Others brought old records, photographs, and handwritten documents proving everything my father had written was true. By the end of the day, I understood something that none of my relatives had seen. My father's final wish had never been about giving away money. It was about keeping a promise, honoring true kindness, and correcting a forgotten act of generosity before time erased it forever. At that moment, I knew I would finish what my father had started. No matter what it cost. A week after returning from the rural community, every member of the family received another message from the attorney. We were asked to gather once again in my father's office for the reading of the final page of his handwritten letter. This time the atmosphere was completely different. Nobody arrived smiling or confidently talking about money. The arguments from the previous meeting had disappeared, replaced by nervous silence. Everyone knew that whatever was written on the final page would decide the future of the entire family. I walked into the room carrying the documents and photographs that proved everything Amara Ndlovu had told me. The attorney accepted them with a quiet nod before placing them beside my father's letter. Around the table, my relatives avoided looking at one another. My brother Mandla sat quietly with his arms folded, no longer speaking with the confidence he once had. My mother, Namand, simply closed her eyes for a moment as if silently praying. When everyone had taken their seats, the attorney carefully unfolded the final page. "My beloved family," he began reading. "If you are hearing these words, then you have already shown me the truth about your hearts." Every person in the room became completely still. I never created this inheritance to reward greed. Money can build houses, but it cannot build character. Wealth can provide comfort, but it cannot create honesty, gratitude, or love. His words filled the room with powerful silence. I already knew some of you would become angry. I knew some would search for legal loopholes instead of searching for the truth. I knew others would think only about protecting their own share. That is why my final wish was never a test of obedience. It was a test of character. I looked around the room. Several relatives slowly lowered their heads. No one interrupted. The attorney continued. Those who chose to honor my promise, respect the truth, and show gratitude have already proven they understand the values I spent my life trying to teach. They will inherit not only my property but also my complete trust. Then his words became even more direct. Those who cared only about protecting their wealth have already received their answer. A person who cannot honor kindness does not deserve the full reward of another person's sacrifice. A deep silence settled over the room. The attorney explained that my father had already prepared different inheritance arrangements. Those who had tried to block his final wish would receive only the smaller portions required by the will. The greater share would go to those who had faithfully carried out every instruction without complaint. No one argued this time. My brother quietly wiped tears from his eyes. One uncle stared at the floor in shame. Even the cousins who had searched for legal loopholes said nothing. For the first time since my father's funeral, everyone understood what he had been trying to teach us. His greatest gift had never been his business, his property, or his money. His greatest gift was giving every one of us the chance to choose between greed and integrity. In the end, our inheritance was determined not by our family name, but by the kind of people we chose to become. Several months passed after the final reading of my father's letter. During that time, I stayed focused on completing every part of his last wish exactly as he had written it. Together with the attorney, I returned to the rural community where Amar and Lovu lived. This time we were not carrying questions. We were carrying the promise my father had waited years to fulfill. When we arrived, Amara welcomed us with the same gentle smile she had shown me before. She had never expected anything in return for the kindness she had shown my father all those years ago. In fact, when the attorney explained that part of my father's estate now belonged to her, she quietly shook her head. "I didn't help Bakizwi for money," she said softly. "I only wanted him to have another chance." Her words reminded me exactly why my father had respected her so deeply. I handed her my father's final letter addressed only to her. As she slowly read his handwritten words, tears rolled down her face. In the letter, my father thanked her for believing in him when the whole world had turned away. He apologized for never finding her sooner, and asked her to forgive him for taking so many years to keep his promise. For several minutes no one spoke. Amara gently held the letter against her heart and whispered, "He never forgot me." At that moment, I knew my father's greatest burden had finally been lifted. Back in Pretoria, the remaining inheritance was distributed exactly as the will instructed. Those who had respected my father's final wish received everything he had planned for them. Those who had allowed greed to guide their actions received much less than they expected. This time no one challenged the decision. Everyone understood why my father had made those choices. Some family relationships slowly began to heal. My brother Mandla came to me one afternoon and quietly admitted that pride had blinded him for many years. For the first time in our lives, we spoke honestly without competing against each other. My mother found peace knowing her husband's final promise had finally been fulfilled. Not every relationship survived. A few relatives refused to accept the truth and walked away from the family forever. They chose anger instead of understanding. Although it was painful, I realized that not every broken relationship can be repaired. One quiet afternoon, I visited my father's grave alone. I placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and stood there for a long time. The wind moved gently through the trees as I remembered everything that had happened since the day of his funeral. Looking back, I finally understood what my father had been trying to teach us. His greatest gift had never been his business, his land, or the money he left behind. Those things would one day disappear. The real inheritance was something far more valuable. He gave us one final chance to choose honesty over greed, gratitude over pride, and integrity over wealth. His final wish shocked our entire family, but in the end, it gave each of us the opportunity to become better people. As I quietly thanked my father, I realized his greatest legacy would never be measured by what he owned, but by the lives he changed long after he was gone.